Hello. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of my office hours. Happy Friday. It's Friday as we record this. So as many of you know, we put these office hours out on YouTube as well so that they can be watched later on. That's why you will often not hear me have a lot of dead air in these sessions, and I often may be talking to myself, but because we are recording this. But as we record it, it is a Friday before a weekend, and we are also fast approaching the holidays, which is cool. Usually there's a few minutes before questions start to come in. So I tell stories or talk about what's in the news or something else that may be relevant. Obviously, there's been a change to my environment. I got something behind me. As many of you may or may not know, I host a podcast called the CDO Matters podcast. And I got this fancy new neon sign. Actually got it a number of months ago. I posted a few things on LinkedIn about my struggles with the sign. But to make a long story very short, I love the sign and I want to try to find ways to make it work. But it wreaks havoc on video cameras. I'll show you what I mean. LED lights are not consistent. They flicker. And digital cameras operate in something called the frame rate. They actually flicker as well. And if those frame rates are out of sync, it does this. So can you see the weirdness, the throbbing in the video signal, which drives me nuts and would drive anybody nuts. So there's no sign. But yes, as you can see, I actually have a remote control for my pet sign. So I've been working for months to try to figure this out. I've tested cameras, including this very expensive Nikon Z5 mirrorless full frame camera. It doesn't work. I've tested multiple cheap Logitech webcams. That doesn't work. So the quest continues with my sign. I see Haley. I've got a number of folks helping me today. Kayla and Haley and Ben, all on the Profisee team helping to produce this. We are waiting for questions. I see, where's everybody joining from today? I'm joining from the East Coast of Florida, in case anybody didn't know that. I have the awesome option of going for walks on the beach in the morning, which is really kind of cool. Which is neat for me because I'm originally from Western Canada. So I spent my first 25 years in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. If you even know where that is, so hats off to you. If you know where Edmonton is, it's north and west. So find maybe Montana on a map and then look up again. And you'll find Edmonton. But I'm well aware of the cold. I spent my first 25 years in a place where it can snow literally any month of the year. And as a matter of fact, over those 25 years, I can remember snow every month but one. I can recall vividly a significant snowstorm in June and a significant snowstorm in August, which means July is the only time when I was ever growing up where it didn't snow. So now I live in Florida. So that's, you can't blame me after 25 years of freezing and shoveling snow and dealing with that. Maybe you can't blame me for moving to Florida, but Canada's a wonderful place. Edmonton's a wonderful place. It's the capital city of the province of Alberta. And if you haven't ever had a chance to go, I would absolutely recommend going. There's this little place called Banff. It's in the mountains. It is one of the most beautiful places on the planet Earth. So if you get a chance to go to Alberta, to my home, I certainly recommend it. I see Haley asking for questions. Need a few years to defrost. Yeah, I think I'm still defrosting. Maybe that would explain, some of the weird things that go on in my brain. But yeah, a few years to defrost for sure. Still waiting for questions to come in. If folks are out there, if got questions about MDM, data strategy, data governance, I used to do this. Well, not this. On LinkedIn and, not being, holding, monthly office hours. But I used to do this for a living with Gartner. So I was an analyst with Gartner for MDM and for data quality and for data strategy and data governance. And companies would pay a lot of money to subscribe to Gartner services, whereas a part of that subscription, they could get access to me and to ask questions about how to execute MDM and how to execute data governance. And now I'm doing this for free, no strings attached. Honest, no strings attached. So if you've got questions, happy to answer them. When I was at Gartner answering these questions, I'd say the top 3 or 4 were, number one was most certainly always related to the value of investments in data. I would get questions a lot with things like, how do I get stakeholders to engage in an MDM effort or a governance effort? How do I get funding for MDM or for data governance? Or we're having a hard time getting traction. We're having a hard time executing. And almost always those things would come back to a company's inability to connect investments in data, whether that's MDM, data strategy, data governance, data quality, doesn't really matter, but a company's inability to connect those investments to actual tangible outcomes, right? And be able to say a dollar invested in MDM yielded $2 in business outcome. I would often start my conversations at Gartner by asking my clients, okay, well, what are your metrics of success? What does success look like for your MDM program? And the answer was really one of 2. One was, we'll have better data. Or 2 was, in essence, we don't really know. Or 3 was, we'll have implemented technology, right? We'll have successfully implemented a governance tool. We'll have successfully implemented MDM. That will be our yardstick of success. The software is up and running, it's configured and good to go. Well, none of those, whether it's better data quality, whether it's obviously no metrics, we can disqualify that one. Implementation of technology or better data, those are not business outcomes. Sorry, folks, don't want to break it to you, but better data is not a business outcome. A business outcome is something like, lower cost of goods sold, or increased manufacturing efficiency, or increased customer retention or satisfaction, selling more. Those are business outcomes. And can you show how investments in data drive those outcomes? It was a common theme. Okay, I see Haley, somebody's asking a data related question that you're going to bring on. Yeah, I'm ready. Interrupt me. Oh, yeah. Peter Madruga asks, are you an Oilers fan? Of course, I'm an Oilers fan. I'm born and raised in Edmonton, Alberta, and not just Edmonton, Alberta. So, I mean, there's professional football in Canada. It's the Canadian Football League, but Canadians, we're just not as fanatical about football as Americans are. Like, our thing is hockey, man. I mean, that's it. Technically, our national sport, believe it or not, is lacrosse. But it's all about hockey. So it's not just that I'm from Edmonton, and that's really the only kind of mainstream big league professional sport club there. So that you're kind of required to be an Oilers fan if you're from Edmonton. But I'm from Edmonton, where I grew up in the 80s and 90s, which means I got to watch some of the greatest hockey. Yes, I'm biased, of course, but some of the greatest hockey I would argue that has ever been played. Wayne Gretzky, Jari Kurri, Mark Messier on the same line, right? That was the forward line. The defense was Paul Coffey and a number of others and supporting cast on the defensive line. But those 3 right there, I mean, it was a symphony on ice. And I don't say that lightly. It was amazing to watch. They revolutionized the game of hockey, the way it was played, the passing, the finesse, where you bring the puck from one end to the other without dumping it down to the other end and without chasing the puck all over the place. It was pass, move, pass. It was amazing. So yes, I'm an Oilers fan. It doesn't have anything to do with data. but thanks, Peter. But oddly, over the last 20 years, I've lived in a combination of, over the last 25 years, I've lived in a combination of Virginia, Texas, and Florida, where hockey is not as readily accessible, at least over the airwaves, as it used to be where I'm from. So I have sadly kind of fallen from actively following the Oilers day in and day out, just because of where I live. But I'm still a fan. Another interesting kind of side story. Growing up, from the age of 12, and I'm not kidding, the age of 12, I started working in a summer job. My family and I lived close to a golf course And I started a summer job when I was a little kid, working on the driving range at that golf course. And I was on the weekends, I'd go and I'd pick up golf balls, these little things, picking up the golf balls that were into the trees and that were kind of off to the side of the driving range. I eventually graduated to the point of driving the little truck that went and picked up the balls on the driving range. But at that golf course, Wayne Gretzky was a member of that golf course. So growing up, I got to see Wayne Gretzky like often. As a matter of fact, Wayne Gretzky has borrowed my golf shoes. This is back in the day when you still had the metal spikes for golf shoes. And now all the golf shoes don't have those spikes, but he borrowed my spikes easily half a dozen times. For whatever reason, he kept forgetting his golf shoes. I don't know why, but he would come, and I worked in the pro shop. So I graduated from picking up golf balls like that to driving a little truck where everybody is shooting at me on the driving range to actually working in the pro shop of the golf course. And Wayne would come in and he'd always forget his shoes and he'd borrow my golf shoes. So yeah, that had nothing to do with data, but I will tell my Wayne Gretzky story all day, every day. All right. Any more questions? And thanks for Peter. That's a good way. Friday. Mark unanswered. No, I think I answered that question. So number one question that I would always get at Gartner, pretty much always, and forgive me guys, I got a kind of a bit of a sniffles here. Pretty sure it's not COVID. It's just allergies. When you live in Florida, things bloom all the time. Number one question was pretty much always related to ROI, business case, and how do we tie investments in data to business outcomes, and how do we quantify it? How do we build a business case? That was kind of key theme number one. Number two was implementation, almost always, right? How do we actually put a roadmap together? How do we start to put the shovel in the ground? We've got the funding. Maybe we've even got a business case. It almost always never happened, but we've got the funding. We got the support. We put the team together. Now, how do we do it, right? How do we start to put the shovels in the ground and implement a governance program, implement MDM, or actually execute on a data strategy? That was kind of key flavor number two, I should say. And those conversations were interesting. Pretty much kind of always, I would fall back to building more of an MVP-driven roadmap. So as you can tell, that's real gray hair. And that's earned by being in the data space for a long time and having failed many times implementing MDM, implementing governance. So I've kind of learned the hard way how not to do things, as well as the 1,500 plus conversations I had as a Gartner analyst, plus the probably several hundreds of conversations I had with data companies around data while I was a consultant prior to joining Gartner. And while I was working at Dun & Bradstreet for, almost 7 years, working with companies all day, every day. So I know what works and I know what doesn't work. And when it comes to implementation, what I saw over and over and over and over again, and I hate to throw consultants under the bus because I've been one, and they offer unbelievable, incredible value. Like 90% of MDM software platforms are implemented with consultants. At Profisee, we rely heavily on them. They're our partners, and we mean that. So consultants are incredibly important in our space. They add a lot of value, but at the same time, what I would see over and over again was consultants involved implementing governance, implementing MDM, implementing data quality, where the consultants would kind of follow their patented wash, rinse, and repeat, right? Where it would be, okay, phase one, discovery, right? Well, even before discovery, it was phase one was requirements gathering, right? Because so many companies that I would talk to at Gartner or in any of the other roles that I'd mentioned, so many others would not know how to define a scope. They would not know how to put their kind of arms around what their needs were, what their requirements were. They knew they had a data problem, right? They knew that their reports were inconsistent, that they knew that their operations were inefficient, and they needed to go fix the problem. And they got some money to try to go fix the problem. But in terms of like defining the requirements there was almost always a phase one engagement, define the requirements, and then phase two was the go get it done, right? That's the typical consulting pattern. It still exists to this day. It's just kind of tried and true. It works. But for that phase one, where it's like, okay, it would be a 3, 4, 5, 6 month long initiative to go and define the requirements, right? When you're talking about MDM, the group would go talk to, the consultants would go talk to finance, and then they go talk to marketing, and then they would go talk to logistics, and they go talk to procurement. They talk to all these groups. It would take weeks and weeks and weeks. And naturally, of course, everybody would want to put their 2 cents in, right? Everybody would want their views, their requirements. So after, let's see, a 3, 4, 5 month long kind of requirements gathering exercise, consultants would come back with this giant scope, right? That covered everything: multi-domain, cross-functional, enterprise-wide data governance, or MDM. Hey, that sounds fantastic. Let's go implement on phase two. And phase two, given the fact that phase one was this highly collaborative endeavor that everybody got to put their 2 cents in, where the consultant didn't have any sort of outcomes from the start in mind, right? They were figuring out the desired outcomes as a result of this requirements gathering exercise, where procurement would want better processes for onboarding suppliers and better KYC, where finance would want GL, general ledger optimization, and marketing would want to improve customer experience and customer retention, and on and on and on. Everybody would throw that in, right? And where it would produce this massive galactic scope. And sometimes companies would say, okay, great, let's go do it. Where let's go do it was a 12, 16, 18 month engagement that, by the way, is never 12, 16, or 18 months. They're always bigger than that. But where that would, because it was enterprise wide, because it was massive, it would be, hey, let's go discover our data. Let's go profile our data. And not just any data, all of it. Right? Like, and 4, 5, 6, 7 months would go by. And by this time, you're almost a year in, right? Because you spent 4 to 5 months defining the requirements. And now you're 4 to 5 months into some discovery and data profiling process. You're a year into it. You've got 25% of a data catalog, 25% of a business glossary. You've got 25% of your lineage all documented in Visio flowcharts as far as the eye can see. You've got a year, and what do you have? Like nothing. You've got some interesting anecdotal information. You've got pieces of some of the puzzle, and then lo and behold, you get a new CIO, or you hire a new CDO, right? Or you get a new CFO, right? Or a new budget season comes along, and new executives look at this like, man, we've been paying a lot of money to insert big consultant name here, right? McKinsey, Deloitte, EY, Accenture, Infosys, Tata, doesn't matter, right? Man, we spend a lot of money here, and what do we have? What do we have? It started out as this, my reports were broken, or I had duplicate customer accounts, or the CEO was getting frustrated because he or she didn't know how many customers we had, or didn't know the full extent of a relationship with Acme Incorporated. And now we've got this giant thing. We're a year in. We've burned through hundreds of thousands of dollars, and is this really the right thing to be doing? That was such a common pattern. I mean, it was really kind of disturbing and sad, and which led me to figure out from a scale and roadmap and implementation perspective. Now, this is data quality, this is data governance, this is MDM, data strategy, by the way, as well. We just need to stop doing that. We need to stop doing that. That doesn't mean stop using consultants. What it means is that step number one, you got to have a few desired outcomes in mind, right? You can't just let the consultants go wild on doing whatever they want to do, and loosely defining some scope and loosely defining some requirements based on having interactions everywhere across the organization. Because the minute you invite everybody to the table, then everybody's opinion counts equally, generally, right? And so, yeah, there is a little bit of kind of controlling the outcome here, but what you want to do is have some idea of 1 or 2, maybe 3 outcomes in mind. And by outcomes, what I mean is like, increase customer retention, increase customer satisfaction, cross-sell, upsell, reduce cost of sale, reduce costs, holding costs related to our inventories or our key materials used for our production processes, whatever those outcomes are, but like literally actual KPIs that matter to the business, like 1 or 2 or 3 of those. And optimally, those 1 to 2 to 3 should tie back to some high-level business priorities that your CEO and everybody in the C-suite really kind of cares about. Right? That's the perfect scenario where you sit down and you have conversations with your C-suite to say, hey, listen, we're going to focus on these 3 things. We are not going to boil the ocean. We are not going to get into this galactic, drawn out, massive scope data related initiative. We're just going to focus on these 3 things. They're important to you. This is where we're going to start. We're going to be iterative. We're going to be agile. We're going to deliver some value, and then we're going to do it again, and then we're going to do it again. But you're not going to have to wait 18 months for us to get halfway through a data catalog. So that's step number 1, is that you have some outcomes in mind, and you get the CEO, CFO, CIO aligned. You get the functional leaders aligned. So whoever owns that KPI, whether it's procurement, whether it's marketing, whether it's finance, doesn't matter. Whoever owns that KPI, you get them involved, you get them aligned and say, this is where we're going to be focusing. You have some difficult conversations with others who may want some stuff too. They may want some goodies and say, hey, you don't get your goodies right now. You have to wait. CEO's behind it. Sorry, you're 3rd or 4th in line, right? So that's another part of it. You have some sort of prioritized list of outcomes that you want to deliver. Focus on 1, 2, or 3, then engage the consultants and put a fence around them and say, hey, consultants, I need you to enable 10% cross-selling and upselling through more effective customer hierarchies and more effective customer data management. Like, that's it. That's your scope, consultants. And with that, the consultant can say, okay, perfect. I know what's in scope and I know what's out of scope, and I can go execute on that. And defining the requirements for that is not going to take 6 months. Well, unless you work for like the biggest of the big company, but chances are you probably don't. So requirements gathering for that's not going to take 6 months. Doing the data discovery for that is not going to take 6 months, and on and on and on, right? So getting back to core topic number 2, often discussed when I was at Gartner, was all about implementation. How do I get it done? The answer was be agile, be iterative, focus on an MVP, be laser focused on an MVP. But it really, really starts with corralling consultants and giving them very, 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 very specific guidance on what's in and what's not in scope. It's so important. Another thing to think about here, especially from an MDM perspective, and I would argue a governance perspective as well, is that another thing you should probably really try to avoid doing. And again, this speaks to scope, and this does speak to kind of corralling your consultants, is can you focus initially on more analytical outcomes, right? Meaning, especially when you're talking about MDM, but to a lesser extent, governance as well. Can you focus on a business outcome that is enabled simply by better insight, better analytics, better BI? I'll give you an example. It's one that I love to use because to me it's abundantly obvious. So at Gartner, I used to take a lot of questions related to supplier optimization. I would say probably a good 20 to 30% of my interactions, my inquiries with clients were related to procurement and supplier. And I would argue that if you have a goal of optimizing your relationships with your suppliers, that was a common theme, especially coming out of COVID, right? Because everybody saw supply chain related problems, the supply chain slowed down. And a lot of businesses were like, okay, wait a minute, we need to optimize how we interact with our suppliers. We need to be more specific and more selective about who we're doing business with, and on and on and on. Step 1 to optimizing our supplier relationships is to understand our supplier relationships, right? Kind of goes without saying, right, guys? I mean, and I would argue you can do that, or you can at least start that process and deliver incredible value simply by answering the question of how many suppliers do we really have? That's an analytical process, right? We're not talking about single version of the truth. We're not talking about merging records. We're not talking about changing the business processes of how suppliers are onboarded, or any of your existing KYC, anything, or KYS, know your supplier, any of the other due diligence that goes into selecting and onboarding a new supplier. I'm not talking about changing those business processes. I'm just talking about a report that's accurate, consistent, trustworthy, that shows you how many suppliers we have. If you can do that, you can start to ask some questions like, oh, okay, well, wait a minute, hold on a second here. We have the same supplier across these 2 divisions, or these 2 plant, or these 2 operating locations. We didn't know that. And can we have a single agreement here instead of two different agreements? Oh, or by the way, we have lots of different agreements with the same supplier, but they've got different terms, right? And we haven't had this visibility before because I'll give you an MDM use case. The data was being aggregated, Acme Incorporated, Acme Co., Acme and Sons, Acme LLC. There were 4 separate supplier IDs and we didn't know where they were the same. And lo and behold, we can look at this now. We can actually accurately aggregate information related to that supplier. Could be a customer, could be employee, could be anything, classic MDM. Can I accurately aggregate information about this to at least start asking some questions of, okay, how could I optimize this? Maybe we need more consistent terms or better pricing across our suppliers. You can start doing that without merging anything, right? All you need is a report. All you need is the insight to start doing it. Yeah, the holy grail here of MDM is often, not always, but is often more operational changes where you do create some version of a truthful master record for supplier, customer, asset, or location, right? That's often where you want to get to ultimately down the road. But for now, can you simply just have accurate reporting where you could revisit your terms with a given supplier, where you could start to ask some questions like, could we consolidate these agreements, or should we be looking somewhere else for, or maybe our supply chain is a lot more risky than we thought it was because we didn't know there was a corporate relationship between these two suppliers. So it's that kind of stuff. Can you, through some sort of MVP approach that is on phase 1, reliant on improving analytics, right? Just improving the analytics, can you drive some business value by taking that iterative approach and that really kind of small, limited scope approach? Answer, yes, you most certainly can. You most certainly can do that. And I would argue you could do that in weeks, not months and not years. But still, I saw so many of my clients. Sorry, I'm getting some coffee here. My throat's getting a little dry, all the yapping. It's just so often I just saw so many of my clients were kind of falling into this wash, rinse, and repeat of the major consultants. And again, I've worked with them. I've worked for them. Some of these consultants are just incredibly smart and incredibly valuable and are helping, enable all these digital transformations. But at some point we got to say, hey, the horse is running wild out in the pasture. Maybe we need to kind of limit, how much running is allowed here, and maybe that's my fault, right? And maybe I need to put a little more control around some of the scope and some of these consulting SOWs. Don't these things work unbelievably well? These Yetis, if you have one, it's. I poured this coffee like 45 minutes ago. It's still really, really hot. Yay, a question. Thank you, Kayla. Adul asks, I know it's a very large question or vague question. I don't know. We'll see. I see a good number of organizations understand the importance of data governance. They say they do, and are creating new teams for data governance. Yep, see it every day. And for execution, there are no number of startups that are selling their tools for data quality, MDM, privacy catalog. What is your view on going with tools to implement data quality, MDM, privacy catalog using vendor tools to create in-house solutions? Oh, that's not a vague question at all. Thank you. I like the question. And Kayla, if you could keep it on the screen for a bit, that would be awesome. Love it. Great question, Adul. Thank you. So tools. We really got a double-edged sword here. I work for a tool provider. An MDM tool literally pays my mortgage. So thank you, Profisee, and thank you that tools are needed in our industry. Can you do MDM, data quality, data governance without tools? Yes, you can. Yes, you can. The tools enable scale. The tools enable automation. The tools enable flexibility that is not really kind of there when you do things manually. So there's no kind of magic answer here of when there's a kind of a break point between being able to do things manually and requiring a tool. Kind of in my number of years, decades of doing this, particularly MDM, what I've seen is companies hit about 102 million, 300 million in revenue. That's where things really start to break, at least from an MDM and a data quality perspective, where the manual fixes of these things where you just can't, using a bicycling metaphor, you can't pedal fast enough, right? The manual workarounds, the manual integration processes, the manual data quality cleanups and fixes, where at a certain point you just can't keep up with the demand, and you need a tool to start automating some of these processes. When it comes to governance, MDM, data quality, that's really what these tools are about. Single places where you can manage highly configurable business rules to enable data management. In the case of MDM, that's business rules related to your shared data. In the case of data quality, that's business rules related to all of your data, or at least significant subsets of your data, where you can configure and manage these rules and execute them in a way that is repeatable and scalable, in a way that was never available to you because you were just throwing bodies at the question. So can you do, in essence, data management, right? Data management, MDM, data quality, data integration, BI and analytics. Can you do that without tools? Yes, you can. But for most companies once they hit a certain size, it just gets really, really onerous and really, really, really expensive. Now, I will also say, that a tool is not necessarily always the answer, right? Tools are only one of a triumvirate of required pieces here. Also, our good old friends people and our good old friends processes. Tools, people, processes, systems, people, processes. It's those three. And data management requires all three. So if you're in an IT organization and you think that a tool is going to be a silver bullet, it is going to solve your problems, it's not going to, because all of these tools require you to configure and manage business rules. In the governance world, we call them policies. They're just business rules, but just with a different label, right? All of these tools require some form of business policy, business rules to be defined. As much as I would love MDM and data quality and data integration tools to be kind of smart out of the box and just kind of know automatically somehow the best way to run in your organization, they don't, right? Because they need to be told, when is something accurate or inaccurate? What are the rules that I'm going to use for deduplication? What are the rules I'm going to use for data merging? What are the patterns that I'm going to use for integration, right? How am I going to transform data in a consistent way or normalize data in a consistent way? These tools don't answer those questions on their own, right? They all need the business rules defined for them. That's where people and process comes into place. And that's largely where governance comes into place. You'll hear me use the word governance. And the way I look at governance is kind of classic macro governance. Governance are the policies and procedures used for effective data management, used so an organization can drive the ultimate value from their data assets. Governance policies control the accountability and usability and applicability of data as it's consumed in an organization. That's what I think of governance, right? When you think of governance from a tool perspective, governance is very, very limited. It's if you go to a data governance tool vendor, they will tell you that governance is essentially data cataloging, data profiling, maybe a little bit of metadata management, and maybe a little bit of policy management when it comes to access and permissions of who can see what, right? But if we were to look at a classic governance framework, DAMA, D-A-M-A, has a great one. There are other governance frameworks out there. If you just Google data governance framework, they all kind of look largely the same. When I was at Gartner, we had a great data governance framework. It's fine. But again, they all look largely the same. If you were to Google data governance framework and you were to look at the DAMA, D-A-M-A model for data governance, what you would see is a whole bunch of stuff. And if you line that up against what governance tools do, data governance tools do like 20% of governance. So I don't know how the industry kind of writ large landed on, well, this is a data governance tool, because they only enable like portions of governance. The biggest kind of, for lack of a better word, kind of yellow card, to use a World Cup metaphor here, the kind of the biggest yellow card, if not a red card, of data governance tools is that for most of them, there's a hard break between policy definition and policy enforcement. Meaning, even if you've got a data governance tool that will allow you to capture some data governance policies, most of the time those policies are being enforced in other systems, including other data management software like MDM and data quality or data integration, or even necessarily within applications themselves. where you're enforcing a data governance policy within a CRM system, for example, about who can see what data, or who can update an account record in Salesforce, or who can update an ERP record in SAP, right? So enforcement of data governance policies is happening all over the place. Yet we have vendors out there saying, well, this is a data governance tool, trying to convince us that it does all of data governance. They don't. They do a subset of governance. Sorry, guys, I'm kind of passionate about this, but I see a lot of people who are kind of new to our space and new to data management, and they're looking at tools, and this one says MDM. Okay, it does MDM. That's really kind of what it does. And as a part of that, it'll do maybe a little bit of data quality, maybe a little bit of data integration, maybe a few other things like workflow management, but it's not meant as a BPM tool for an organization, but it'll do all these things. But we're not expecting MDM to be an enterprise class data quality tool. We're not expecting MDM to be an enterprise class integration tool generally. We look at data quality, and it does data quality stuff. And it does some things like normalizing data, standardizing data. It even does some entity resolution matching, same thing that MDM does. And on and on. My point being here is that when we look at data governance, we say, oh, it must do data governance because it's a governance tool. But I would argue that the amount of data governance supported by data governance tools is a fraction of what most organizations need from their broader data governance framework, right? Data governance covers a lot of different stuff, retention, archival. It's all in essence about policy. It's not about capability, which is vendors would have you believe governance equals capability, technical capability, like discovery or profiling or metadata management. Vendors would have you believe that governance equals capability, but it doesn't. Governance equals policy. Capability support policy. So I remain optimistic that in the future that we will have governance tools that actually allow you to manage, define, capture policies across the entirety of a data governance framework, and not only capture them and define them, but deeply integrate with every system that would be consuming those policies for policy enforcement. That's the kind of the future state, the holy grail, I believe, of data governance that is a long way from there. So I went on a little bit of rant about data governance tools. Just something to keep in mind. You're not going to get every aspect of a data governance framework if you go buy a data governance tool. But typically, if you buy an MDM or data quality tool, you're going to get 80 to 90% of the requirements that you would fully expect from an MDM or data quality tool. And rant. Thanks, Kayla. Bart, hey, neighbor. Bart and I used to live like in the same neighborhood. So cool. Glad you could make it, Bart. Thank you. In your experience, what business function is the most objective in facilitating the business data governance discussion? Finance seems to be a common candidate, but interested in your view. Yeah, it's common. In my experience, CFOs own data governance 15% of the time ish, maybe upwards of 20% of the time. In terms of like facilitating a discussion or ownership of a governance program, let's talk about ownership. When it comes to data governance, ownership is a little bit of a misnomer, particularly if your scope is going to be more enterprise-wide, which typically it is, right? So by definition, governance is cross-functional, right? Everybody's going to have a say in how customers are defined. Everybody's going to have a say in how maybe less so in suppliers, but there are certainly plenty of cross-functional, particularly master data domains that span multiple functions within an organization. So the idea of ownership there is really a bit of a misnomer, because ultimately what you're talking about is the creation of some sort of committee or multiple committees, that would exist and operate at an enterprise-wide level, and then committees that exist and operate at more of a functional level. So that kind of like what we would see organizationally is multiple data governance committees. When it comes to who's driving, who within the organization is going to be kind of the glue, as it were, to drive governance forward, typically it's a CIO or a CDO. Typically. It's not uncommon. What I see is for CIOs or CDOs to play a little bit of a disproportionate role at the beginning over, let's just say, ownership, right? Where it's the CIO or the CDO that is really kind of driving the creation of these committees, that is driving engagement in the committees, that is playing a disproportionate role in staffing each of the roles that would needed for, you know, the various domain experts to be contributing their insights from a policy perspective at a functional and an enterprise-wide level. But ultimately, where we want to get to is that from a governance perspective, policy definition. So keep in mind here, guys, governance really about two things: policy definition, policy enforcement, right? And when I talk in governance now, at least from kind of the perspective of Bart's question, I think I'm really kind of focused on policy definition. And policy definition happens typically within some form of governance committees at multiple levels of the organization. But starting at the top, typically it's almost always a CIO or a CDO. Yes, finance can play a role there, but finance tends to be a little bit of a bull in a china shop when it comes to data governance. And I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just finance organizations tend to be inherently conservative, and we want them to be conservative, by the way. That's not a knock. They tend to be inherently conservative, and because they control the purse strings, they tend to have a disproportionately, what's the right way to say this? A disproportionately powerful way of influencing governance policies, because that's where the money gets counted and they control the purse strings. And everybody else who needs budget allocated for finance, what I've seen historically is other functional owners will almost always bend to the will of finance because they got the money, right? So, and I'm not saying that there's ill will here, and I'm not saying that finance organizations are kind of, you know, will set out to kind of dominate governance conversations and dominate governance policies, but I've seen that just kind of naturally evolve, right? And I've seen this at a lot of manufacturing companies. I've seen this at a lot of CPG companies where finance leaders get fed up with the state of data, right? And they say, okay, we need governance and we need data quality, MDM, all that other stuff, but we need governance and we're going to drive. And where finance kind of jumps into governance, finance starts convening these committees. They start defining the scope. They start identifying what the needs are from a people and a process perspective. But where it comes to defining the business rules, finance tends to almost always lean towards top-down, more heavy-handed, even though may not be intentional, but more heavy kind of handed approaches to policy, where it is, this is how it has to be, because this is how we recognize revenue. This is how we abide by the laws. This is how we remain compliant, and everybody else, thou shalt adhere to these rules. Sometimes that top-down approach is applicable and it's useful and it's good, making sure that you don't get sued or you don't break the law. That's pretty good, right? But other times what we're seeing now is more bottoms up, more decentralized, more autonomy at functional levels is also a good thing. So it tends to be a little bit of both. And their very nature as a kind of a cross-functional shared service, IT kind of has the DNA to operate in more of that highly collaborative way. And finance organizations just tend to kind of not necessarily need to, at least historically. They just kind of say, this is how it's going to be. This is how we recognize revenue. These are our policies. So, sorry, Bart, long-winded question or long-winded response to a very simple question. Typically, if I had to recommend, I would say a CDO, go hire a chief data officer to lead a governance initiative. If you don't have a CDO, generally going to be a CIO. CFO is obviously going to have a huge seat at the table, without a doubt. Don't get me wrong, but I would be, from a recommendation perspective, option 1 CDO, option 2 CDO, and then beyond that, yeah, I mean, that's the 15 to 20% where finance is actually driving a governance initiative. Awesome. Another question. Maybe I need to start answering more quickly. I thought I was buying time. Kate, thank you for your question, Kate. And Bart, thanks for your question, buddy. Good to hear from you. Startup company where the data is the product is analytics and dashboards. I have some experience here. I worked for Dun & Bradstreet for almost 7 years. So I worked for a company where the data is the product. Engineering is skeptical of a separate BI team having data engineers to own BI. BI team wants ability to build and scale pipeline warehouse and how they need to for BI without being subject to engineering priorities. Wow, what a great question, Kate. And I experienced this. I mean, I didn't experience it directly because I wasn't managing an engineering team when I worked for a company where their product was data, but I get it, right? Where engineering is the product, but engineering has got BI, analytics, MDM, data quality. And man, this is a tough one. This is a tough one. Engineering skeptical of a separate BI team, having data engineers to own BI and warehouse and pipeline. Well, how would I approach the team structure in that scenario? Having led engineering teams and having watched this situation play out, I really think it comes down to who is the customer, right? And I know that may sound a little bit trite and a little high level, but who is the customer, right? I think it's appropriate to have separate teams when the customer is internal versus the customer is external, right? And if your customer is internal only, if you are an IT organization, a CIO organization, an internal data and analytics group, and your customer is only internal, and you were funded through allocation or however you're funded internally, that's your world. Go solve your customer needs, right? And go meet the customer needs. But if your customer is not internal, separate group, separate priorities, separate roadmap. Things get a little sticky where you have shared infrastructure. and this is where I would kind of turn to my accountants and for kind of some accounting foo to help allocate costs equally across external customers and internal customers. Hopefully you're doing that the right way. You have some great accountants that can help with that, because I would fully expect that some of the infrastructure there is going to be shared. Most certainly your hosting is going to be shared. Probably some of these tools are going to be shared across those worlds. But I would just defer to who's the customer, internal versus external. Draw a line between the two from a costing perspective, an allocation perspective, and a budget perspective. Things get a little complicated when it is shared infrastructure. I get that point. But the skepticism, oh man, I think that could also speak to kind of team leadership as well. And maybe bringing these groups together, maybe to hold some shared offsites. But there's got to be some team building that can be done there. But ultimately you want people focused on customer needs, and that's a good thing, and like rabidly focused on customer needs. And if there's skepticism, that seems to suggest that maybe there's some fear of people taking jobs, or I don't know, there could be dynamics there that I'm not privy to, but that's a pretty high level answer to the question. Hopefully that gets it, but I get it. Because I've seen this play out. Garega, nice to see you, my friend. I hope you are well. Blockchain. Oh, you teed this one up. You knew I gave a presentation last week about blockchain and data management. So thank you for the for the layup, using a basketball term. So I want to know, what are the case studies or use cases that we can build upon using blockchain, and what are the pros and cons of the feasibility? Well, there's not a lot of them out there from a case study perspective. I will be honest. So I did give a presentation last week at the Data Governance and Information Quality Conference. By the way, if you have not gone, if you are in the data world, if you are in a governance or stewardship role, or if you're in data and analytics, BI role, the DGIQ conference is fantastic. I absolutely recommend it. They do it twice a year, in the summertime in San Diego, in the wintertime in Washington, DC. I just came back from the DC event. But definitely recommend DGIQ. It's a great conference. There's a real sense of community there that's rather palpable, which is cool. And you will be around birds of a feather. Everybody there are data people like me, and probably you. So unlike other conferences where you go, I went to a Microsoft conference and it was like, HR people and SharePoint people, like, InfoSec people. And those are wonderful people. Don't get me wrong. It's just not data people. So I did give a presentation on blockchain. I think the blockchain will be transformative in the data management world. I absolutely think that it will enable and support what I'm calling data sharing ecosystems. If you think conceivably about what is MDM within a company, MDM is about breaking data silos that naturally exist within organizations. CRM versus ERP, right? Data silo, how do you break them, right? MDM is great at that. If you conceptually think about individual companies as silos, company 1, company 2, company 3, could you apply something that looks like an MDM of MDMs, where you put something over multiple companies to allow them to realize efficiencies of data management that would not be there within an individual company? The answer is yes, you most certainly can. You most certainly can. And the story that I tell is, just taking a B2B example, but this happens in B2C all the time. B2C marketers are trying to figure this stuff out in terms of, how do we get a view across the entire industry of one person? They're working on these things called clean rooms right now that are supposed to replace third-party cookies to allow for visibility on user behavior and user demographics and what people are doing out on the web. But in a B2B use case, the story that I tell, what I said during my presentation is, if you're a relatively large company, chances are you've got a record for Verizon, and you've got one, and you've got one, and you've got one, and they're all largely the same, and that data is being managed all largely the same. And everybody will say, well, no, we're unique, and our Verizon, no. When it comes to high-level B2B data about companies, about people, about assets, about locations, about material, particularly reference data that is by definition shared across industries, a lot of that data looks very, very similar, and it's all largely managed the same. And you're managing it and stewarding it over and over and over and over and over again. Could you use some new technology like blockchain or other data sharing platforms to start managing that data in more of a shared way, where instead of 15 companies having 15 records for Verizon, well, in reality, it's probably closer to 100 records for Verizon because data is badly duplicated. Could you have one that sat in some sort of MDM of MDMs, where it was managed as a shared asset in blockchain, where there was an incentive layer, yes, crypto tokens or some sort of digital value exchange, so I always say, I don't say crypto because it's a bad word these days, digital value exchange, where you're actually incentivized to manage that data that is shared by everybody. That's blockchain. Shared data ecosystem where there's governance baked in, it's baked in to that blockchain about who can update the data, when is it a valid transaction, an invalid transaction. That's governance, folks. That's policy. It's governance with an incentive layer. That's blockchain. But Greg, to your question, I think for now, in the short term, the use cases are going to be far more simple, right? So that's my forward-looking future state where I think that there could be unbelievable value delivered by blockchain by allowing the creation of shared data ecosystems. I think in the short term, the use cases are simpler than that. Lineage. I mean, lineage is the big one. Anytime you need provenance of data, anytime you need to be able to track data, for example, through maybe a complex supply chain, where data could be a product that is moving through a supply chain, and where you need to know, and you need complete visibility on that, and you need that data to be well governed and well managed and well structured in a shared asset that is available to everybody. So I think that's lineage is a classic one. There are so many use cases out there. Supply chain is one of them. If you've ever bought a home, at least I can speak to Canada and the United States. I can't speak to anywhere else. But if you've ever bought a home, land titles, where you instead of having these physical pieces of paper that are a land title, like, could you digitize that in some form of an NFT that exists as a smart contract on a blockchain, where it is immutable, it's out there, available for everybody to see, and you can track it, and you know it's valid, and you know it's accurate? I mean, like land titles, insurance policies. The list of use cases is longer than my arm. But to your question, Garaga, are the case studies out there today? No, they're really not. There's very few. There's a limited number of case studies where this is being supported. I need to do a little bit more research, because somebody was at my presentation said that they were actually using blockchain within a large healthcare organization. But there's not a ton of them out there, but I need to do some more research, because I think that there's meat on this bone, metaphorically speaking. And I think we need to see more successes here, because what we see in the media and what we hear about is anything but success. We hear about crypto scams, and we hear about the crypto market melting down, and we're not hearing about how blockchain could enable somebody who's buying an orange at Whole Foods to see where that orange came from, who picked that orange, on what date, when was it shipped, how was it shipped, under what conditions was it shipped. I mean, that's what we're talking about, lineage. And I could easily, that's another use case here, like tracing food, right? I just, again, the list of potential use cases here is really, really long. It's only a matter of time. It's coming. Blockchain will help enable some of this stuff. Data management will be caught up in it through data lineage, through data provenance. I would argue through reference data management as well. I think that MDM vendors should be racing towards blockchain, particularly for reference data management. Because why, as an individual company, you would have to go and source your own reference data on your own? I don't. It should be available from some sort of data marketplace that is available through your MDM provider, or your data quality provider, or even maybe your cloud provider. So lots of use cases out there. Thanks for asking the question, Garanga. Always good to see you. Is there anything else out there? No, questions are gone. We've got 5 minutes left, guys. We got 5 minutes. And I still have voice left, which is amazing. I can keep complaining about my sign. Oh my goodness. The story that I tell, so kind of writ large, I'm trying to build like a real studio here, like, and make this, kind of legit and look nice. But I don't know. I didn't know anything about AV, like audiovisual, before embarking on all this a few months ago. And kind of the story that I tell is what I needed was like my own little private Best Buy in my office here, where I could go to a shelf and say, try that. Is that working? No, that's not working. And what about that? Okay, I'll go try that. I'll go try that. But my shelf has been Amazon. And I've been buying stuff like, oh, okay, I need some microphones, or I need a plug, right? And like, I'll just plug it in. You figure it works. It's like, oh, hey, here we go. Like, no, it doesn't work. It's like, why? What? Well, as it turns out, like even subtle little things, like I didn't even know this. I don't have my little microphone, but like, in a stereo jack, the little like stereo jack, the 2 little rings is different than the 3 little rings around the plug, right? And that actually means something. The 3rd ring is for a microphone, and the first 2 are for left and right. That I didn't even know, right? Like, and I'd plug things into like a DSLR, right? And expecting there to be sound out of it. And there's no sound. There's no sound, right? Just all this stuff. And then I would have to return something to Amazon, because I'd go buy buy a microphone. It didn't work. And then I'd return it. And then I'd go buy another one and plug that in. Oh, no, it doesn't work. Oh, hey, Garangas from Feasibility Process. How can we start a POC? Oh, in three minutes. How do you start a POC in 3 minutes? Well, it depends on the scope. Let's talk about MDM, because maybe you're talking about MDM. You can do an MDM POC without using MDM software, I would argue. It's not going to be a very elegant POC, but most vendors, including Profisee, are willing to work with you on POCs, right? Even before maybe a limited POV, we call it a POV, proof of value. But can you find a software vendor like a Profisee who'd be willing to work with you on a POV? And what that POV could include would be, hey, take 10,000 records out of your CRM and 10,000 records out of your ERP and 10,000 records out of somewhere else, dump it into our SaaS-based cloud solution here. We can run some entity resolution on it, show you pretty quickly how badly your supplier data is duplicated or your customer data is duplicated, where there are holes in that data, and where there could be opportunities based on those KPIs we were talking about before. For example, in the case of your supplier data, could you, through that proof of concept or that proof of value, run some basic MDM, configure some basic data matching rules and some basic quality rules in a POC instance, in a sandbox type instance of an MDM provider, where across those 3 sources of data, you thought you had 1,000 suppliers, but lo and behold, you actually have 600 because your data is badly duplicated. Could you use that insight that could be relatively easily, and it could be delivered relatively easily and delivered in a POC? Could you use that to help build a business case where you said, aha, our supplier data is badly duplicated, and lo and behold, these 5 suppliers that we thought were unique really, really aren't unique. They're the same supplier. And can we go optimize our relationship with that supplier? Can we renegotiate our terms? And if so, what would that be worth to us from a dollar perspective? So I would argue from an MDM perspective, it's relatively easy to do a POC, and you can do it pretty quickly. We do that at Profisee through this process we call a BIR, business impact report. So you can most certainly do that. It's all about finding a way to quickly break some silos, to develop some insights that you could use to help build a business case. So that's POC in 3 minutes. But maybe we can continue in another month. There are other things you can certainly be doing. Find vendors that would be willing to work with you on a POC, whether that's an MDM vendor, a data quality vendor, or data governance vendor. We are at the top of the hour. Thank you so much for some great questions today, guys, and some great engagement. Hopefully you got some value out of the discussion where I wasn't talking about my sign or the Edmonton Oilers. But as always, thank you so much. We're going to try something a little bit different in the new year. We're not going to call it office hours anymore. We're going to call it Data Matters Live. So we've got CDO Matters. You can see a kind of a common theme here, but we want to go from what we were concerned is a bit too structured, sounds a little too academic, to a little bit more kind of free flowing. What you saw with me today, right? Talking a little bit about hockey, talking a little bit about blockchain, talking a little bit about data management. That's kind of the direction that we're going. But of course, foundation here is data management. We'll always be focused on data management. So that's what you're going to see in the new year. Thank you to everybody who attended today and who's attended in the past. Really, really, really look forward to exciting